Imagine that each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing that you're happy even while dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. For more support, check out the Grief and Happiness Handbook and cards. I welcome you to listen to this podcast and discover endless possibilities for your life. Aloha. I'm so glad you've joined us here today for the Grief and Happiness podcast. I have a really good guest. I'm so excited about having her on. This is Annie Sklaver Orenstein. She has written a book called Always a Sibling that I haven't read anything like that out there. And I really think siblings are one of the least covered areas in grief. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Annie?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for reading the book and having me on. I'm based in Connecticut, so pretty far from where you are in Hawaii, though I wish it was closer to Hawaii. I'm a qualitative researcher. I work in tech full time, and I lost a sibling. I have two older brothers, 4 years older and 8 years older than myself. And in 2009, my oldest brother, Ben, was killed while serving in Afghanistan. And at that time, I went looking for resources and something about sibling loss and siblings, and I couldn't find anything. I remember going to a bookstore, and there were all of these books on grief, and I looked in the index and I looked everywhere and I couldn't find anything that seemed like it was for me. The message I took away from that was, I guess I'm supposed to be okay. I shouldn't be grieving. The publishing industry, there are books for everything. If there isn't a book for this, maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe this isn't such a big deal. I think that's often what happens to siblings, is their loss gets diminished and forgotten, and the relationship gets forgotten in a lot of ways. So it's been, in October, it will be 15 years. And this book is really, it's very much the book I wish I had. It's the book that 25-year-old Annie really needed and couldn't find. And I'm excited to put the resource out there for other people like myself. And I think no matter how far out you are from the loss, it can still be a very helpful and healing resource.
I agree with you 100% on all of that. My sister, it was 9 years older than I am, and we were adults when she died during the pandemic. She didn't die from COVID, but she died during the pandemic, so I couldn't go be with the family. The whole different kinds of things that happened then. And I've had lots of different losses in my life, but there's nothing like a sibling. They're really different. And I too, even though do a lot of work in the grief field, have seen very little out there on sibling grief. So when I saw your book, I said, oh, yay. But the good news is, on top of that, is that this book is absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
I'm usually kind of a quick reader, which is fortunate since I read so many books for the podcast. But this one, it took me a while to get through because I kept thinking, I got to think about that. And when I have a hard copy of the book, I'm always highlighting. So I didn't have a hard copy with yours. I was reading it online, and I kept copying and pasting out a document of things. Oh, I want to talk to her about this or this or this. After the first chapter, I think I've got the whole thing. It would have been highlighted. So I had a hard time going through and picking out the things that I'd like to talk about the most, because you just brought up so many really important things. And those of you who haven't lost a sibling, those important things, most of them apply to you too. So I'd really recommend the book to anyone. I was just looking at one of the quotes that I copied here. So one of the hardest parts of grief for me was the realization that I needed to be an active participant in my own healing. That's an amazing statement, because I think A lot of people look for someone to heal them or something that they can just read about something and all of a sudden everything will be better. And that's not the way it works. Your book, you mentioned about creating your own mourner's user's manual. And I just thought that that was great because grief is different for all of us. Everybody experiences things in a different way. We all experience some things and not the others. And there's just not really a one size fits all. So what you've done with your book is quite remarkable with guiding people on maybe you want to include this, maybe this is what you want to do through the whole thing. And it's just jam-packed full with great information. This might be kind of an unfair question, but what do you think about in all you've written helped you the most?
Oh, that's such a good question. In general, before the book, I was struggling a lot. Where I am with my grief now feels light years from where I was when I first embarked on this project, which initially I didn't think was going to be this book. So that's a whole other story. I didn't initially set out to write this book on sibling loss. But when I started the first iteration of this project, it was about 9 years after Ben died, and I was not in a good place at all. I think I was very stuck in my grief. And when I think about where I am now, 5 years later, writing the book itself has been incredibly healing for me. And I think there were a lot of pieces of information that I learned in my research where I thought, oh my God, this was so helpful for me to hear this. This has totally reframed everything. I need to be sure I include this. And there were a lot of those moments, which is probably why it is jam-packed. But I think I really wasn't an active participant in my grief, like that quote you said. And I kept hearing things like time heals all wounds, which is time and a lot of work, maybe. But I was kind of just waiting for time to do something, and it didn't. And so once I really actively started thinking about my brother and our relationship and what it meant to me, and giving myself permission to grieve and giving myself permission to be upset and to have needs and to need something rather than take care of others, I think that's when things really started to shift for me. And I started to take care of kind of myself and validate my own grief, which I don't think I had done since that day in the bookstore when I walked out and thought I shouldn't be upset. So the way the book is structured, which but for our listeners, it's in 3 sections: with, without, and within. And with is all about the sibling relationship and processing that relationship and your memories and the good and the bad and the ugly of whatever your relationship with your sibling was, and really giving weight to how meaningful it is. Because our siblings, a lot of people might know us and know who we are, but our siblings are really the only ones who know why we are. They know why we do that weird thing that mom used to do that we don't remember even doing, right? They know the origin story of a lot of our behaviors, a lot of our thinking, a lot of our attitudes towards things. And so when you lose that, it's very disconcerting. And I think that it was very important for me to give weight and validation to how meaningful the relationship I had with Ben was. And, that's why it is such a big part of the book, because I think as siblings, we don't really let ourselves fully grieve. And that is in part because we diminish the value of the relationship itself. And so if we first really think through how significant this relationship was, whether it was good or bad is really irrelevant. It is extremely significant either way. And I think putting that weight on the relationship allowed me to validate my own grief and to then start admitting it and really trying to examine it and trying to work through it.
That's profound. And I guess I could say it shouldn't be. It should be, that this is just, and you wrote about shoulds in your book. And I love that because shoulds are not particularly helpful. A lot of times I see that people play different roles in the family grieving. And frequently the siblings or the children in the family are the ones that are expected to just take care of things, to comfort the parents or whoever else is there. It puts you in a different role than would really be serving you, which would be being able to take care of yourself or have somebody be able to help take care of you.
Yeah, siblings are very often put in that role. I heard everything from being the one to identify the body. A lot of people who were the ones who told their parents, who got the news first, who planned the funeral, who coordinated everything. And then 6 months later, a year later, they realized no one ever asked me how I was doing. Maybe people said thank you. Maybe it was appreciated. And for the most part, the siblings were all very willing and able to step up in that moment. They would have rather been the ones planning the funeral than have their parents need to do it. So it's not that they necessarily resented stepping up in those first few days. It's just that no one seemed to remember that they were also grieving, that they weren't the funeral director, right? And so I heard two different people said, 6 months later, someone called and said, "How are you doing? I realize you're grieving too." And some people never got that phone call. And those people get very stuck in their grief. Their grief gets ignored, it gets delayed. And that causes all sorts of issues down the road when you try to delay and suppress that grief, because you can't. I think I say this a bunch of times in the book, probably too many, but you can't outrun grief. You just can't. And a lot of siblings try very hard, a valiant effort, but it catches up to you, and it can catch up to you in a very powerful way.
Yes, you just can't stuff it. And it just expands when you do that, I think.
Yes, I think that's a really good way to put it. There's a way to process grief so that it kind of moves through you and it's never gone. There's always a part of it that's moving through you, but it's moving. And I think if you don't do that, to your point, it bottles up, it expands. There's no release valve there. And it just builds up more and more and more. And I think that's what was happening to me. And I think a lot of the work that I did allowed me to open that release valve and to kind of accept that there will always be that little bit of grief coming in that, I'm imagining like a string almost, like it'll always be going through, but I can stop it from building up.
Yes. You mentioned something about the process of writing the book. And for me, I'm a writer. I taught writing at the university level for many, many years and wrote several college textbooks. So writing kind of comes natural to me. And I've had two husbands die. And after the second one died, and we had just moved to Hawaii 2 years before he died, I wasn't really sure what to do with myself at that point. So I just started a lot of writing, not to publish or anything, just for me, journaling kind of writing. And the more I wrote, the more it helped me. And that ultimately led to me writing in a way that I was hoping to help other people. How did you actually get into the writing? Why did you start this project, and how did it serve you? How did it help you with your grief?
I've always really enjoyed writing, and I write a lot of things for work, and I'm an avid reader, but I never thought I would be an author. I did not start out with ambitions to write a book. My brother had ambitions to write a book, and he was the avid writer and journaler. He kept a lot of journals throughout his life. And there was an old email from him I found where I had written him this long email, and he had written back and said, I know you think that I'm the writer, but I think you're the writer. And I found that when I was writing the book, and it made me very happy. But I just enjoy writing because I process things out loud, whether it's out loud on the page or out loud to whoever will listen to me. And when I started this project, what I wanted to do was tell Ben's story. And I didn't even know if it was going to be a book. I wanted to start by interviewing people from throughout his life, his best friends from high school, people he served with in the military, his friends from civilian life. I wanted all of those memories. I wanted those pieces of him that I didn't know, that I wasn't privy to. And I didn't know if it was going to be a podcast or what medium, or maybe it was just going to be a collection of interviews that I passed on to, his nieces and nephews so they could get to know him. And the format of the final output wasn't really important to me. I thought, I'm a researcher. I know how to do interviews. I'm going to do interviews. And I think it's actually really good that I didn't get fixated on a format. I just kind of pursued it. And, over the course of about 2 years, it first took the form of a book, and then I got an agent, and then working with her, we wanted to build my story into it. And then it just kind of kept changing and morphing until finally a few of the publishers we had taken the book out to said, we're not interested in this version, but if you wanted to write a book that is just about sibling grief, we would love to see it. And at first I said no, because I had never found a book that resonated with me. I couldn't really imagine it. And I remember joking to my agent, like, what am I going to do? Write a book that's like 10 ways to get over your dead brother. There's no way. I'm not going to do that. And I also felt like, who am I to give advice? But the more I thought about it, the more I felt like, what if I wrote that book that 25-year-old Annie really needed? You can never please everyone, and it's not going to be the book for everyone, but what if it was the book for her? And so I played around with a few versions. I came up with this structure with without, within, and that felt really right to me. And I felt myself getting really excited about it. And that's when I think I knew that I was onto something, was when I felt excited about it and about doing more research and doing more writing. And ultimately, that's the version that sold. And then I had to figure out how to write it. But I think I didn't set out to write a book. And I certainly did not set out to write kind of prescriptive nonfiction on grief. And yet that's entirely where I landed. And it feels like the right place. I'm very happy that I followed that thread. And I'm really proud of where it landed.
I'm glad you landed there, because it's a much needed book. I can see how you can help so much in dealing with my own grief. I kept trying to read like practically anything I could get my hands on, and it seemed like everything was a memoir. And a memoir is a good thing to write. It's an important thing to write. You don't necessarily have to publish it, but I think it's really, really good to write that story. But what you've been able to do with you is weave your experiences into your story in a way that you're supporting it with other people's experiences too. And then you're talking about real nuts and bolts things of this may happen, or this is a way you could deal with that sort of a thing. One of the things I really liked that you did was describing all the different types of grief. A lot of times we're looking for prescription. We think that there's a way to grieve. And I didn't count them, but you've got a whole bunch of different types
15.
of 15. There you go. See, that's a lot. To me, it shows the diversity of grieving, and that probably what anyone is doing is exactly what they need to do, because that's what resonated with them as a way to manage their grief or experience their story. That's what they need. to me, it seemed like this is really kind of cool to see, that you can find yourself on that list. Anybody can find yourself on that list and see, oh, I'm not the only one that feels this way, because that's one thing I hear all the time. That people go, I'm sure I'm the only one that's going through this, or it's never hurt anybody else as much as it's hurting me. And that's just not true.
Yeah. And I think along with that, there's a perception that you can be doing it wrong, that there's a right way to grieve and thus there's a wrong way to grieve, right? If there's a right way to do anything, then there must be a wrong way to do something. And that's not true. There are some forms of grief that are more harmful than others. There are some forms of grief that are more self-destructive than others. They're not wrong. They're just a different type of grief that if that's what you're experiencing, it's really important to know that that's what you're experiencing, and you can work with someone to shift and to get to a healthier place with your grief. And maybe it's because of this idea of stages of grief, which is, not true, that there is a one right way and an infinite number of wrong ways. And I think what I wanted to do and to really convey in that chapter was that there is no right and there is no wrong. There is a multitude of different ways. And within those 15, they're not mutually exclusive. So really, it's an almost infinite. I haven't done the math, but I think it's an almost infinite number of combinations that you can be experiencing. And it's important to know that just because your grief doesn't look like the grief of someone else in your immediate family or the grief of someone else doesn't mean that either of you are doing it wrong. It's just that you have different ways of grieving. And hopefully as well, learning about that will help people to understand, oh, this explains why my mom does this or why my dad does that. And now I understand where they're coming from a little bit more. And hopefully it gives people a better perspective about themselves, but also about the other people who are grieving this same loss.
That's right. You reminded me of when each of my parents died. My sister and I had entirely different directions in our grieving. It just couldn't have been more different. But as I reflect on that, and with that 9-year age gap between us, our life experience was different and different with our parents. We had different relationships with our parents. We didn't get to spend that much time together with our parents as a family because she got married when I was still in elementary school. And I think what I'm trying to say is comparing doesn't help, that you're not doing it wrong. I didn't do it wrong because my sister did it differently. I think my sister thought I did it wrong in some cases because I didn't do it like she did. And I'm not judging her in saying that. I think that that's just, I didn't realize at the time that that was what was happening, but I think it kind of was.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, she lived way far away when both my folks were going through what they went through. And I only lived an hour away from them. So everything fell on me, which is okay. I was happy to do whatever I needed to do. But I remember at one point, my mom had been living with my husband and I for a while because she had a meningioma, a kind of brain tumor that's not operable, but it causes decline in a different way than regular dementia. But she couldn't live by herself with that going on. And I gave her a choice. I said, okay, you can come stay with me. You can stay in your home if you have someone there 24/7 with you, or we can find a nice senior living place where you can live. And she said, well, I'm moving in with you. And I said, oh, okay. And we were in a fortunate position that we were able to keep her house with no problem, with everything just where it was and like it was, until she came to me and said, okay, I'm ready to go home. That was good too. And I could take her home and arrange for the people to be there with her. Well, those people that were taking care of her, one day when I went up at least once a week and I talked to them on the phone frequently. And I was talking to one of them one day and she said, you have a sister? And I said, yeah. And they said, we thought you were an only child all this time. And I thought, well, that says a lot about how both of us are dealing with this.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one surviving brother, and he and I grieve very differently. And we didn't really talk about it until this book, when I would be writing the book. And there were a lot of times where, I realized I was kind of writing as if it was fact, as if it was like, this is the way it was when my brother died. And there are a few instances where I was like, I should really get Sam's perspective on this. I wonder if he felt the same way. And those moments were so illuminating and so eye-opening. And I'm so grateful that I was able to call him or text him and just ask him these questions, because he never wanted to go back to the cemetery. My brother's buried in Connecticut. My other brother lives in California. And whenever he would come back to visit, he never goes to the cemetery. And I didn't really ever ask, but I certainly had like some guesses. And I finally just asked him about it. And he was like, well, it's just not helpful for me. And it was such a simple answer, but I was like, well, I had not thought of that. I had been thinking like, maybe it's too hard. Maybe there's resentment. Maybe there's this, maybe there's that. And he was like, I don't think he's there. I don't find it very helpful. It's kind of a long drive. And when I'm visiting, I usually don't have, a ton of time. And I don't feel a pull to go there. And it was so simple, but the versions that my brain came up with were much more complicated and heavy than the reality of it. And I think, I learned a lot from that, even just in him setting that example, that there is an expectation sometimes that we do things like going to visit the cemetery, and it's okay to say no if that's not what's going to help you. And he was comfortable doing that. And that was, I think, a really good example for me to take in as well.
It made me think about a difference between my sister and I on things like that, that my family owned an ambulance company that we got when my sister had been away from home for a while. So it was my mom and dad and I who ran it. It was a small business in a small community that desperately needed a good ambulance service. And at that time, you only had to be 14 years old and have an advanced first aid certificate to be an ambulance attendant. And my dad was the person who taught the first aid classes in town. So he made sure that when I was 14, I was already trained and ready to go on ambulance calls. And that was quite an experience. And I think a lot of the influence from that, when it came to time for funerals for people, I had absolutely no interest in seeing someone in a casket. I couldn't do it. And I'm sure it was because of all my experience working with what I was working with. I wanted to remember people as they were, with the vibrant people. And I can remember my sister saying one day after one of our parents died and we were at the mortuary, somebody was trying to coax me into going up. Well, you need to go up and see your mom or whoever it was. And my sister says, Emily doesn't do that. And it just cracked me up. I think I actually laughed when she said it, because nope, I don't do that. She was right by the casket talking to everybody who came in and went by, and I was on the other side of the room, and that was okay with me, and I was okay with her doing what she was doing. But I think my point is that we all do things in our own way, and nobody else needs to judge me for it, and I don't need to pay attention to anybody's judgment about it if they do.
It's interesting too, because some of those traditions, like, you're kind of born into them, whether or not it resonates with you. Like, I'm Jewish and we don't do open casket. And so the first time I saw or was witness around open casket was when I was in high school, and I went to a friend's grandmother's wake. And I remember my mom like warning me about what I was, and I remember thinking, this will be cool, like it was like a cool, like, science experiment kind of thing. And we went, and I was like, I never want to do that again. Like, I feel very grateful that I was born into a culture where everything is closed casket. When I've gone to wakes or open casket funerals since then, I don't totally know what to do, because I'm like, I don't want to be part of this. And I hadn't really thought of it, but we were in a situation where we couldn't open the casket if we wanted to. But I do think that it's just interesting how our traditions and customs around death are kind of pre-dictated in many ways based on religion or culture that we were kind of born into. And there isn't often permission to say, well, this one doesn't really work for me. You have to be able to stand up for yourself in that way, which is not an easy thing to do.
No, it really isn't. I started when I was pretty young, because my grandparents died when I was younger. And I remember going with my folks to the funeral home before the service, maybe the day before. They had a viewing, but it wasn't a formal thing. If people wanted to come in, they could. And I thought, I don't want to go in there. Why would I want to remember my grandparent looking like that? Because I knew that in my head, that was the picture that I was going to carry with me for the rest of my life. And I was a child when I made that decision. But that's where it all came from. I didn't want that memory. And I made a conscious decision about that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think I could talk to you all day long. You're so interesting to talk to. And your book is just absolutely fascinating. I can't recommend it highly enough. Whether it's a sibling for you or anybody else that you're dealing with grief about. And also, I'd like people to follow your example of writing about your grief, because it seems to have really made a different impact in your life to work through things through the writing.
Yeah, it really did. It made a huge difference. And it's ironic, probably isn't the right word, but my brother, who is the diarist, whenever I was upset about anything, would say, write it down, go write it down. And I would so defiantly not write it down. Even if I wanted to write it down, as soon as someone suggested I write it down, then I couldn't. I was like, nope, I can't. Now I will make sure I never write it down. And I remember in the early years after he died thinking, man, Ben would really tell me to write this down and to write about this. And I just couldn't do it. And I didn't really start writing or journaling or anything about it until, 9 years later. And in a way, I think that was what I needed. Maybe I wasn't ready earlier, and that's okay. But it did transform my grief in a lot of ways once I ultimately did.
I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast, because this I think is really going to be helping a lot of people. I have lots of people listen, and I know that there are lots of brothers and sisters out there that haven't been able to hear this kind of a conversation before. So thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me.
And to those who are listening to this podcast today, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you'll be back next time, and that you'll be joining us on some of our Sunday Grief and Happiness Alliance gatherings. Remember, there's no charge for them. It's just you get to come and write together and meet your peers and be able to talk to them. And it's a great place to be. So I hope you'll join us on Sundays, and you can find out more about that on our website, griefandhappiness.com. And hopefully I'll see you again next time. Thanks. Do you want more comfort and support and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance at our free gatherings on Zoom every Sunday. Visit my website at griefandhappiness.com and read my books, The Grief and Happiness Handbook, and get your set of the beautiful Grief and Happiness cards. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge listen to all of our episodes. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode of the Grief and Happiness Podcast.